This is Nice Guy Eddie, and you're listening to In My Humble Opinion on Rainbow Radio.
My guest tonight is a former naval aviator, senior defense analyst, a writer for Dame Magazine, the Los Angeles Blade. Her book, American Fascism, How the GOP is Subverting Democracy, is available on transgresspress.com and Amazon. She made several appearances on my show back in 2016. It's my pleasure to welcome back Brynn Tannehill. Brynn, how are you doing?
Doing good, Eddie. How about you?
Not bad, not bad. Hanging in there. We were talking before the show a little bit about the COVID vacation, as you mentioned it. And yeah, it's getting a little bit old. Not going to lie.
I've already worn out one pair of pajama bottoms this year.
I need some new sweatpants for sure. Now, I had an opportunity to read your book prior to this, and I got to tell you, this is some pretty scary stuff. Why don't you fill the folks in on a little bit on what this is all about?
So to give you kind of an introduction and a preface, back in 2016, on October 31st, I was at this big meeting for LGBT leaders behind the scenes, and a lot of activists were sitting up at the front of the room, and me and the lawyer at the back, who were there to throw cold water on people's ideas, were sitting in the back. And during one of the breaks, one of the organizers and I talked, and I looked around the room and I said, so what if Trump wins?
Right.
Look at all of the stuff we're talking here is predicated on Hillary winning.
Yeah.
What if she doesn't? And he's not gonna. Yeah, but what if he does? All this goes poof. He's like, we'll figure it out. And here's the thing, is we never did figure it out. And on the days after the election, I recognized that this was really, really bad. And that there had been some things during the 2016 campaign that really pricked up my ears and went, ooh. One of the ones that really got to me as somebody who did some World War II studies and Weimar Germany studies was Trump echoing one flag, one people, one God, right? And I'm like, dang, that's a little too close to, one nation, one people, one God.
Yeah.
Which became Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Gott.
Yeah.
Which was the German motto from 33 to 45. And I'm going, ooh, this is getting a little too close to that.
And we saw the death of the euphemism. We saw that throughout the primary, where everybody else was still talking in the typical Republican code. And, it was not about keeping out Mexicans. It was about border security, and it wasn't about immigration. It was about jobs, and it wasn't about Muslims. It was about the war on terror. And Trump comes out and says, nah, the Mexicans are drug dealers and rapists, and the Muslims are coming to kill us. And it's like, whoa, wait a second. Hold on. You weren't supposed to say that. But like, what's with this guy?
So that's something I do address in my book.
Yes.
And so the book was an attempt to wrap my head around how did we get to a point where we had this right-wing populist takeover of American government?
Yes.
And then the next question was, okay, well, how bad is this? Mm-hmm. And then the question that comes after, well, how bad can this get? And how bad is this? Is, okay, well, how do we prevent it from going to the bad place? Right. And the answer was, we got here in great part due to racism, slavery, and all the original sins of the nation, combined with media that was basically an arm of the Republican Party, combined with religion that in itself is racist. There's a deep history of racism in white Southern evangelicism and wealth inequality. And then the bad news that came about was how hard it's going to be to recover. But what you talked about, Trump and how he talked to people in 2016. And Hannah Arendt, the Holocaust historian, described fascism and totalitarianism as dropping the mask of hypocrisy, right? And that's what Trump did. They stopped talking in code, and he started talking to people using the words they wanted to hear.
Right.
That this is what they secretly believed. He was speaking the secret desires of the Republican base, or the Republican base, and they loved that he was saying what they wanted to hear. He sounded more like Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh or Tucker Carlson than Mitch McConnell or John Boehner or Eric Cantor or Paul Ryan, who would still wrap racism and anti-LGBT animus and a desire to create a Christian state in euphemisms like freedom of religion and school choice, black on black violence, any of these things that they would normally talk about to try and disguise just how nasty they were.
Yes.
And Trump pulled the mask off of what the GOP really was. And the terrifying part was that there is enough of them, and he keeps them motivated enough that they don't care when the mask comes off. They like that.
Right. And the GOP is learning that lesson. And one of the scary things, because I kind of suspected this, or knew this, I should say, going in, and it certainly was confirmed throughout, that for all that Trump did, Trump was just the latest thing. It was not, as you mentioned, you can trace the lines all the way back to slavery, but you also point out like the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 by Ronald Reagan. And that's something that I know a lot of my listeners are going to be familiar with, because that gave rise to Rush Limbaugh and eventually Fox News. But the fact that everybody thought Trump was going to lose once he started speaking plainly, if you will, shows that actually these folks were already there in great number. They've been there all along. And we're just now aware of it. But just like gay and transgender people prior to, society coming to accept them more and more, they were there all along, but the racism, it was there in critical mass in large numbers. And we're talking about now trying to stop it or whatever. But it's like, but wait, this didn't just start.
No. And Barack Obama has a great quote. It did not start with Donald Trump. He is the symptom, not the cause. And that's actually the quote that leads off my book. And that was one of the key things I was pointing to, is that Donald Trump is an expression of the id of the Republican Party.
Yes.
And if we didn't get Donald Trump, eventually we could have gotten someone like him or worse, who figured out, hey, playing to the base actually is a winning strategy.
Right. Is there something different, do you think? Because, those words we've heard before. Karl Rove was famous for that. But this is different, isn't it?
Even under George W. Bush, whatever you say about him, to an extent, he was still something of an institutionalist. That Dick Cheney was a creature of the Republican right dating back to the 70s. He was one of the people that sat down with freaking Art Laffer in 1974, I believe, right? So these were Republican institutionalists. There was still some respect for traditions and norms, and Bush did some good things. He wasn't completely mired in spewing hate and banking on it. After 9/11, a Sikh businessman was murdered in Mesa, Arizona.
Yep.
He went on TV and pleaded, Muslims are our friends, they're our neighbors,
right.
They're our students, they are part of America. This is not representative of them. Don't take it out on it, which was, whatever you say about Bush, he could at least temper whatever nasty impulses he had at times. Donald Trump does not have any of that. Ron Brownstein, who's a professor of history who specializes in fascism in North Carolina, observed that Donald Trump's greatest gift was his ability to go for the jugular and latch onto the zeitgeist of the base and exploit it. Right. And that's a talent. It's probably the only positive thing I can say about Trump, is that he's good at reading the room.
There's a charisma to it. Keith Olbermann once described Rush Limbaugh as having a perverse majesty, especially earlier in his career. And I think that applies to Trump. There is a charisma. It's not a charisma that appeals to me. I've loathed him since the 1980s, and I was like 12. I saw through him as a child, and he has rubbed me the wrong way. But yeah, I'm not going to take away from that. Clearly, he's speaking to a large number of people and has a meeting out of his hands. And
going back to the 80s, Trump was always what he was. The man has not changed, except for perhaps his vocabulary and syntax growing smaller and more garbled.
Yes.
And
he spoke less back then, though. He's had to say more things now. So I don't know that it's gotten worse. I just think we didn't know it back then because he didn't do a lot of the public speeches and whatnot.
But this isn't in my book, but somebody actually did a study of his monologues and interviews. And yeah, they've actually gotten more simplistic over time. Right. My book talks about how Donald Trump communicates a little bit. And I'm a geek. I acknowledge it. So I'm going to use a geek reference, right? Donald Trump speaks in code words, right? Caravans means hordes of invading brown, indigent, useless breeding immigrants, right? And when he says the word caravan, people get all of that out of it just from that one word, right? American carnage, right? Brings to mind the whole panoply of what the right wing thinks about American cities and Black people, right? Yeah. So it's almost a metaphor language like Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra in Star Trek, if you're familiar with that. And everybody else,
you're not cool. So you know what? If nobody gets that reference,
go watch it. Season 5 of Star Trek Next Generation was some of the best TV ever.
Exactly. Yeah.
So having a limited vocabulary to describe things isn't that much of an impediment to the things he's trying to communicate, which are images and feelings.
Right. One of the themes that I think you did, I was happy to see it, but I wish maybe it's just me. But the idea of the both siderisms, because you talked about the media, we talked about the right-wing media, and I want people to be very clear, and I harp on this a lot. There's Fox News, there's OAN, and what's the third one? Newsmax, right, Newsmax. Right. And it's funny to see, because for years, Fox News always had we're the number one show on cable, and it was because basically conservatives only listen to Fox, whereas liberals split their time between CNN, MSNBC, NBC, PBS, NPR, et cetera, 6-7 different outlets. Well, yeah, of course, none of them are going to have enough to compete with them. But now that Fox News has some competition on that side, they're dropping in the ratings, which doesn't make me feel good because OAN and whatnot are even farther to the right than Fox. But the thing is that the mainstream media or the balanced media or the not right-wing, like there is no liberal media, even MSNBC, if you look at it from a bird's eye view, is striving for this balance and to avoid the liberal media label. And they try to pay lip service to both sides or present a balanced argument. And it's like the truth is not halfway between what two sides are saying. If one side is telling the truth and one side's lying, there's not room for opinion on every single point of fact.
There's this great thing that's known as Ocrents law. It basically says that there's not always two sides to an issue because sometimes something is just true.
Right.
And that's something that the American media has had a very hard time dealing with, as one party has veered very, very sharply to the right, and the Democrats have veered a little to the left.
A little to the left, and even, I submit, in some cases, they've been pulled to the right along with them. Not the far right, but right of center in some cases, depending on the issue.
The specific things that Democrats have been pulled to the left on tend to be fairly narrow, like gay marriage.
Right. So purely social
and
issues.
A little bit on some social issues.
Yeah.
They're starting to admit that, yes, they do like spending money to solve economic and social problems. They're admitting that, yes, we do want to raise taxes on the rich. They're moving a little bit towards that, even if, it's a 3% corporate tax raise.
Right.
The GOP, and there's actual data to support this via several separate sources, they've gone way farther to the right. And the media hasn't adapted to that. In order to be fair and balanced, they'll have some regular Democrat or scientist, and then they'll have somebody who's just going to lie their way through it and gish gallop their way to inspiring fear and confusion. And if anybody doesn't know, the gish gallop is a rhetorical technique where you just lie so much that your opponent can't conceivably debunk all of the lies. And if they fail to debunk all of the lies, then that thing that's left hanging gets treated as a win for the liar.
Right.
That's another part of the American media. They don't know how to handle blatant lying. Why? Because it's kind of the Seinfeld rule, where it's not a lie if you believe it, right? And nobody knows whether or not Donald Trump actually believes the things he says or any of the things that these other Republicans believe, unless they're just outright religious right zealots.
Well, and
for a better word, that are saying things because they believe God says as well.
Right. But I don't believe for 1 minute Donald Trump fits in that category. You don't clear a church parking lot with tear gas so you can stand in front of a thing holding a Bible for a photo op. I mean, that doesn't seem like what Jesus would do. So,
Well, above and beyond that, Trump was never a religious person. He's never spent much time in church. He doesn't, 2 Corinthians, right?
Right.
Oh,
exactly.
Gosh.
And but in terms of dealing with lying, it is interesting because you do mention the Seinfeld rule, and there is some veracity to that. If I do have a sincerely held belief, it's not a quote unquote lie. But to some of this stuff, and I don't know who said it first, and I've heard it a couple of times, but I don't hear it often enough. I first heard it from Megatron on the Transformers. There's a nerd reference for you. But I think he was talking to Starscream, and he said, "You're either lying or you're stupid." And since he had his gun to him, Starscream was like, "I'm stupid." But but I feel like, you might not be lying, but you're probably stupid. Like you some of this stuff,
Thank you for that awesome segue into the next part of my book, which is talking about the de-evolution and destruction of faith in science and expertise in America. And this has been a long-running pattern within the GOP.
Absolutely.
Rush Limbaugh declared that there's a war between right-minded people and academia and experts, among others. He listed 3 pillars that had to be taken out. It used to be that Democrats and Republicans were equally likely to be college educated 30 years ago. That's no longer true anymore. Democrats have become the party primarily of the educated. And you can look at all the demographic data that says as get below some college education, that's where they derive the majority of their support from white people.
Right.
And as you go forward, you can see how they have absolutely denuded the federal government of experts everywhere. As long as these experts believe things that are inconvenient to them, whether it's that there is a societal and medical need for abortion or that climate change is real. Gay people don't decide to do this just because we choose to be evil and hail Satan,
Exactly.
Conversion therapy doesn't work. But what that ended up with is that when we came to the pandemic, you had a base that fanatically believed Trump, that trusted him more than anyone else, who distrusted all the other media sources, distrusted scientists, distrusted Fauci, distrusted CDC, but they did trust Fox News and Trump. And what made it worse was that Fox News was going to repeat anything Trump said. And anybody who was a Republican who wanted to have their political career survive had to go along with Trump. So in a way, it doesn't matter whether or not he believed it, because Fox News had to echo it, Republicans had to echo it, and the Republican base was going to believe it.
Right.
And there was studies that were done later on in the pandemic that showed that Trump was the largest source of pandemic and COVID misinformation anywhere in the media or social media ecosphere.
I often say that he killed, and I don't know exactly, there's been studies, I'm just going to say somewhere between 0 and all, so I'm going to go with half. He killed 300,000 people with 5 words, "This is their new hoax." And I do understand that that quote was not actually about the pandemic itself, but it's a symbol of him politicizing this and trying to wishful thinking this away and rhetoric this away instead of, taking the binders that Obama left him and the pandemic team and the responses instead and throwing all that stuff out and saying, screw it, we'll wing it. And then politicizing it and telling people, don't wear masks, resist this, don't listen to the experts. I'm like, all you had to say was literally nothing. All you had to do was say, hey guys, this is going to be really tough. You got to do it for me. Listen to this guy. And I'm going to guess half, just because I don't have a better estimate. People would still be alive today.
One of the most up-to-date estimates I've seen is between 60 to 80% of the people would be saved if we'd had an effective government response.
Yeah. And when you look at other countries, I can totally believe that.
What's really interesting to me, though, is that truth or not truth doesn't matter anymore. And it's a very, very Russian thing. I have a section called Pravda, Istina, and Vranyo.
Yeah.
And there was this quote from The Atlantic that just kind of stopped me in my tracks mid-pandemic, because this quote was actually from 2018. It was somebody at a Trump rally who was asked if he cared whether or not Trump was lying. And he says, I don't know, but it sounds good, so F it.
Right.
And that's kind of where we've arrived at. And that's a very dangerous place to be for a society, because again, as Obama pointed out and as other experts on democracy have pointed out, is when you have a society that can no longer have a discourse based in anything even resembling facts or reality,
right,
you cease to be able to have discourse within a society. And this starts leading me towards my conclusions at the end of, oh boy.
Right. And just touching one more point of this both sides thing, and people hear, well, this guy says masks work, this guy says masks don't work, this side says there's global warming, this side says no global warming. Who do I believe? Well, here's a thought. Not the side that has an open disdain for facts. Not the side that has been essentially railing against science, academia, and journalism for the last 30 years. The 3 pillar, well, I don't want to quote 3 pillars, but 3 institutions that are basically responsible for generating knowledge and verifying that these things are true. You have an open disdain for those things. You have a bias that basically makes what you say meaningless. And what I find it's, if you really want to understand Republicans, understand this: the lies they tell about us reveal the truths about them, or just look at it through the lens of projection. Because to take one of their most famous YouTubers and personalities these days, facts don't care about your feelings, right? But the amazing thing is just how unself-aware Nimrod like Ben Shapiro has to be to say something like that, and how just brainwashed his audience has to be.
And that's part of the problem. One of the things I've described with the Republican base now is something called tribal epistemology. that they have a very limited source of information coming in. They don't expand beyond it. And that there's things you are allowed to know, and you're only allowed to learn things from specific ways.
Right.
And that knowledge that contradicts anything isn't something to be looked at and considered. It's almost inevitably heresy. And this sets up a very insular sort of thinking that ends up being conspiratorial. And this is where we start seeing things like Pizzagate and QAnon coming in. And that's another one of the big flashing warning klaxons, going off in the cockpit that says you're in trouble.
The fake news, which morphed from basically made up nonsense that was supposed to generate clicks for advertising filled websites, and that morphed into anything Donald Trump doesn't like, but fake news was an actual thing. This was something that I read on Rational Wiki, where they have an actual article on fake news. And there's a quote from one of these guys that actually generates fake news websites. And he says, we tried it with liberals. It doesn't work because they debunk it after 1 or 2 shares and the whole thing fizzles. Meanwhile, the right will take anything we give them and just run with it, and it becomes viral, and we generate lots of ad revenue. And I'm like, and you should be thrown in a pit for doing that, because they're fucking everything up just for the sake of ad revenue. But again, they know who the audience is. I mean, it's scary to see people. I don't get out of my bubble very often, because years ago I realized I wasn't getting good arguments. I wasn't having good conversations with the other side. And that has become increasingly true. But just the other day, I think I was on Ted Cruz's page. Some guy, and we're getting into the whole corporate masters thing. And some guy says, well, big tech is your corporate masters now. What do you think of that? And I said, well, who do you think is against monopolies? Who do you think was for net neutrality, which would have taken power away from these guys? Who do you think is against big business? And he's telling me that the Republicans are somehow against monopolies and against big business. And I'm like, it's one thing to have a different belief or different opinion, but to look at the Republicans and say they're not the party of big business. They're not the party of the oligarchs. They're the party of the little guy. You don't even know what your party is fighting for. Like years ago, we had a difference about what we wanted. And I mean, that's always going to be the case. There's always going to be people. There's always going to be bigots. There's always going to be people who just want more money for this group or that group. But to look at the Republicans and say they're against monopolies, they're against big business. What? How do you pull that off?
It's been noted that in order for Republicans to survive, Pearson and Hacker have this great book that helped me think about a lot of the problem called Let Them Eat Tweets. And it's kind of a trite title, but the actual content of it by a couple of Ivy League political scientist professors who've written other books like Competitive Authoritarianism, identified within the right-wing American populist movement this dynamic where you have the religious right wanting socially conservative things, and then you have big businesses needing something else, and you need an alliance between the two to put the right-wing populist government in power. But the religious right, in terms of deriving benefit other than Republican politicians in office who will brutalize gays and ban abortion, they don't really get anything out of it monetarily for themselves. They don't get better education or better health care or better schools. They just get vengeance on people they don't like.
Yes.
And corporations really have to work to keep it from the right-wing base, the white nationalist evangelical base, just how little they're actually doing for them or how little Republicans are doing from them.
Right.
And Timothy Snyder, in his book on tyranny, wrote about this concept called sadopopulism, where you have the oligarchs and the Republican leadership who make the lives of the base more and more dreadful, and more wealth inequality and worse health care and smaller social security. Everything gets worse, but then they direct these feelings of things are collapsing, things are bad, and they point at socialists or black people or transgender people and take that diffuse anger at how bad life is and direct it away from themselves.
Right. I think you quoted Lyndon Johnson with if the poorest white guy, as long as he can look down on somebody else, you don't have to pick his pockets. He'll empty them for you.
Yeah. And there's this great quote by Hannah Arendt, and I love this quote. The aristocracy, in a desperate last struggle, tried to ally itself with the conservative forces of the churches, the Catholic Church in Austria and France and the Protestant Church in Germany. And that's what we've seen with big businesses. They have allied themselves with the religious right to get the politicians they want, to get the tax breaks and loopholes that they want. And if you look at, and I'm going to take a jump here, if you look at where wealth inequality is going, it's getting worse and worse and worse. Children who are millennials have less than 50-50 chance of being better off than their parents. It's going to be worse for Gen Z and the gen that comes after that, highly likely. Tax rates are so low, something like 40% of Fortune 500 companies pay zero taxes or get money back from the government.
Right. And that's before you consider things like the fact that we subsidize Walmart's labor rate, for example, with food stamps, because they don't pay their people enough in the first place. And our tax money is subsidizing their labor rate.
Billionaires in America during the pandemic have netted $1.3 trillion.
Yep.
Whereas the general American public, the bottom 50%, has hemorrhaged roughly $1.3 trillion in net worth. Interesting.
Yeah.
But the problem is that wealth inequality is incredibly corrosive to democracy, because what ends up happening is that you end up with oligarchs who what they want doesn't have anything to do with what the public wants or needs, but only they get listened to.
Right.
That if the public has very, very little say in anything, that they can't fund your campaign or your opponent's campaign, but the businesses can ensure that you're reelected.
Right.
Then you're going to cater to the businesses.
Of course.
And between
Customers
Citizens
always
United and people getting poorer and corporations and the ultra wealthy. And what's startling is I found that 2/3 of money coming from the ultra wealthy goes to pretty strictly conservative or Republican causes. And there is an asymmetry in how money from the wealthy is being funneled, and it predominantly goes to Republicans. And the other thing is when they look at asking wealthy Americans what they think about things that are very, very popular with the American public, such as more affordable health care or measures to make college more affordable, the vast majority of Americans, but when you get to the top 0.1%, it drops to 10, 15, 20% support for things that otherwise have 80% support among the rest of the public.
Because their kids are going to college. I mean, they don't have to worry about it.
And that's another thing, too. One of the corrosive effects of wealth inequality is despair, because high wealth inequality means that the American dream dies, that whatever socioeconomic stratus you're born in, you're probably going to die there. And that even if you're born rich and completely incompetent, you'll stay rich.
Well, hell, you can be elected president. And I'm like smirking here, but let's get a little bit somber. There's 2 points that you bring up too, that as people are thinking, yeah, but we can fight. Yeah, but we can vote. Let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court and gerrymandering.
Oof.
I mean, because let's not spoil everything, but I mean, let Supreme Court.
Let's talk about the tactics the Republican Party is using now.
Yes.
The Republican Party has reached the conclusion that they cannot win the popular vote. Right. It's just not going to happen. I have heard no Republican strategists who aren't never Trumpers suggest that somehow in the 2024 election, Republicans will win the popular vote. It's just not there. They don't have popular ideas. All they have is culture war and tax cuts for the rich. That's pretty much their entire arsenal of ideas.
And they are losing the culture war if once you sort of take a step back in a bird's eye view, but it won't matter.
Republicans really have kind of 3 nuclear weapons in their arsenal. And the first is gerrymandering. And the Supreme Court has upheld that partisan political gerrymanders, that federal courts can't step into it, that lies beyond their jurisdiction. Well, this is really bad because you can have states like Wisconsin where 55% of the public votes for Democrats and only 45% votes Republicans, but Republicans still end up with a supermajority in the legislature. And then the legislature strips the governor of a lot of his powers, and you have an unelected minoritarian government ruling over a population. That's really, really bad. That's not democracy. When the vast majority of people vote for something and the politicians say, yeah, no, we're going to put in our own guys.
And at every chance they've gotten, they've also stacked the courts with people who will support those as well.
And they've stacked the courts. The courts have shifted definitively towards the right, and the courts are going to guarantee that voter suppression and gerrymandering survive, which brings me to the next one. We have close to 300 voter suppression bills going around state legislatures right now as a result of the Stop the Steal conspiracies about there being election fraud. Most intelligent Republicans, if you get them behind closed doors, will admit, yeah, there was no election fraud. This is to try and shift the demographics that vote for us in our favor. Back 10 years ago, in North Carolina and Texas. They changed the voter ID laws based off of looking at the demographics and saying which kinds of voter identification are Black people and Hispanics least likely to have, right? And they got their hands caught in the cookie jar in North Carolina because one of their chief strategists died and his hard drives and thumb drives fell into the hands of his daughter, who was a Democrat.
Right.
After he died. And we had smoking gun proof that these were racial gerrymanders, which are still technically illegal. But the Supreme Court looks poised to overturn what's left of the Voting Rights Act after they got rid of the enforcement mechanisms in Shelby in 2013. So voting rights are going down. Suppression is happening. We've got gerrymandering locking in permanent Republican majorities in something close to half of the United States, regardless of whether or not they could get elected in fair elections.
Right.
The last piece, and this is the one that's kind of the terrifying one, is that the Republican Party is setting itself up in 2024 to steal the election, either through state legislatures refusing to certify electors or the House and Senate refusing to certify electors, which would then throw the election into a deadlock, which would then get tossed to the House. But the way the Constitution is written is if it gets tossed to the House, it's not one vote per representative. It's one vote per state. And there are more Republican red states than there are Democratic states. And a lot of the states that are red because they're gerrymandered, which means we could have an election wherein a Democrat clearly wins based off of the rules that everybody should be playing by. And instead, they're going to basically use a glitch hack in the game to take the election for themselves. And this is probably the worst of all possibilities. And then there's other things that they're doing, like stuff with reapportionment, census, and using that to help them in their gerrymandering. But all in all, we're rigging the system such that the American political system is heavily, heavily tilted towards Republican control. And again, this is anti-democratic and it's dangerous because of geographic polarization, that the red states are getting redder and the blue states are getting bluer, and that in particular, rural areas are shrinking, but they're getting much, much redder, and urban areas are getting much, much bluer. But the urban areas are the areas that produce the vast majority of U.S. GDP.
Right. And I do want to touch on that, on the money trail in a moment. I kind of want to finish up with that. So a couple of points. For those who think, oh my God, this is not going to happen, this is pie in the sky paranoia. First of all, we had, and you described this in your book, we had a rehearsal run of this in Michigan, and they tried to hold up the certification of the vote here. And it took one Republican who broke ranks and lost his job over it to get them to do the right thing. If you think the Supreme Court is going to help you, where were you 20 years ago? Because there's already a precedent of the Supreme Court essentially stealing an election for a Republican. Bush may have won. We don't know what the count would have been because they stopped recounting it, and the official count stood where it was in Florida, and the rest is history. And so there's already precedent for that. And the court is significantly farther to the right now than it was in 2020.
Sorry about that. Obviously, I meant in 2000.
So something I want to touch on, and you touched on it too, is that we are watching the Republican Party purge anyone who would object to an attempt at a steal in this manner next time. Right. They're getting them out. And don't forget, 2/3 of Republicans in the House voted to overturn the election. And they're trying to get rid of the ones who didn't vote for it. And Trump is making it clear that he is going to use his bully pulpit and his PAC with a lot of money to try and rig the election so that if he runs next time, that option to steal the election that way is absolutely on the table, and even more likely to succeed next time.
And the only reason these people think that there's any fraud in the election, aside from Trump is telling them that, is because they can't imagine a scenario in which Trump would have lost. In a fair election, I don't think Trump can possibly win again because we've seen the product. There's no, well, maybe it'll be this way or that way. No, we've seen what happens, and nobody wants that again. But he could cheat, he could buy it, he could essentially have a soft coup and steal the election. And we've seen all of the groundwork being laid for that.
I'm going to disagree with you there.
Okay.
I could envision certain scenarios where Trump legitimately came back and won the next election with a minority of the vote the same way he did in 2016. A repeat of something like 2016 is plausible. I wouldn't say winning the popular vote is plausible, however.
No. Well, and even 2016, though, because I mentioned before we were talking, I was listening back to the last show we did in 2016, and I think I started out the broadcast saying, well, Hillary Clinton currently leads Donald Trump 350 to 1, whatever it is, and obviously didn't work out that way. But I mean, if you had said that she was going to win by 3 million votes, but lose by 30,000 votes spread across 3 states that had gone blue since Bush the Elder, I would have thought you were crazy. And now I think you're right. I think that there's definitely more possibility of that. And again, it goes back to the voter suppression and whatnot. And it's a scary thought. I mean, so then there is a glimmer of hope, narrow as it may be. Because if people are saying, well, what can we do? I mean, I don't want to give up. And we're not here tonight trying to radicalize everybody that we can hear, although we do want people to be aware of what's going on. What is the way forward? What is the possibility do you see?
So I'd like to scare people for a moment here.
By all means.
This book is titled American Fascism because the longest chapter in this book is that after I've discussed all these things, is talking about the ideology underlying the GOP and its base today. And we've already established that they're not interested in democracy. We've already established that they'll all unite behind one singularly bad leader who will represent their id. But there are other aspects of it. And one of the big things is, what are the characteristics of fascism? And I identified misogyny and sexual anxiety after a lit review and looking at what the consensus of 10, 15 different acknowledged subject matter experts in the field were. Contempt for the poor and the weak and human rights, belief in a better mythic past followed by a descent into depravity that make America great again, anti-egalitarian and xenophobic fear of changes in the social order. Well, a lot of this is a response to Black people and LGBT people gaining more equality and acceptance in our society. Government and religion are intertwined. One of the primary motivations of the Republican base is to make America a Christian nation. Rejection of expertise and anti-intellectualism is a common theme within fascism. So is powerful continuing expressions of nationalism. Make America great again. America first foreign policy.
How they've couched every criticism of right-wing policy for the last 30 years is they want their people to hate America. They hate America. And it's like, how I feel about America has absolutely no bearing. It's an ad hominem attack, but it's, again, like you say, the nationalism.
So my quote at the end of the book actually addresses that exact thought. It's Morgan Freeman's character, William Somerset, in the movie Seven.
Yes.
Ernest Hemingway once said that the world's a mighty fine place and well worth saving. I agree with the latter.
Yeah.
Corporate power and the wealthy protected, suppression of labor, anti-urbanism and agrarianism, who the real people are. Republicans are all about real salt to the earth, white rural people being the real Americans,
Yep.
the heartland. Selective populism headed by a single man from which all political power flows. Well, they're all kissing the ring down at Mar-a-Lago this week
Right,
and next
exactly.
week and every week hereafter.
Right.
Until he keels over of old age. Enemies are both weak and strong, creating a sense of victimhood and power. Well, look at how they're treating trans people right now. Trans people are going to destroy humanity, and everybody will turn trans and forget to have babies and will die out as a species. But trans people are also gross and disgusting and pathetic and weak.
Yeah, exactly. And you can apply that to immigrants. You can apply that to Black people. You can apply that to gay people as well. And it's very consistent.
And the final characteristic of fascism that I identified as a common theme is conspiracy theories and propaganda that create an unreality, which feeds into fears and scapegoating.
Right.
Yeah, QAnon and storming the Capitol over a stolen election.
Right.
So this is the thing. This is a party that is ungrounded in reality and tried to storm the Capitol and wants to end democracy. And they hate trans people. They hate LGBT people. They regard their enemies as absolutely evil. They even tried to kill Mike Pence. Okay, Mike freaking Pence, you know, the one who calls his wife mother and won't meet with a female official without escort, right? They tried to kill him too.
The guy who actually did outlaw abortion at one point, you know, even though that was quickly overturned.
So the question I have is, if this Republican base had ultimate power to make decisions over everything, would they decide that just banning trans people from bathrooms was enough? Would they decide that making homosexuality illegal again was enough? Or would they keep going to the next step and the next step and the next step? And famed fascist scholar Umberto Eco basically wrote that no, fascism and fascists cannot stop. They always need the next war. They always need the next enemy. They will keep going because there can be only eternal and perpetual war. And Timothy Snyder noted the exact same thing, the politics of eternity. And that's what I'm at, is if they get power, if this power is something that can no longer be challenged, if we end up in something that's known as competitive authoritarianism, what's going to happen to the people that they hate and fear and despise? And I would suggest that we are closer to it can happen here than we have ever been in American history.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how to stop that.
Yes, let's, because I would like to sleep tonight. Dubious proposition, I have a feeling, but go on.
So the solution to this is more democracy. And unfortunately, we've gone so far down the rabbit hole that studies that look at countries that begin falling into competitive authoritarianism, which is characterized by politics where there's still voting and elections and nobody's getting beaten at the polling places, but your vote doesn't matter.
Right.
Because the election is effectively rigged by changing the rules of the game or capturing the referees.
Right.
And we see this in Hungary and Poland, Russia, Turkey, India, which are all kind of right-wing populist religious governments. We don't want to go there, and we just described why. But the way to stop that is to do whatever it takes to make the playing field level again, so that we can actually have politicians who need to pick positions that are good for the public, that are popular, that represent as many people as possible. Yes, does that take us back towards some of Bill Clinton's triangulation? Yes, but we've basically fallen off the board to the right afterwards.
Right.
And that means passing things like the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, because what's left of the 1965 Voting Rights Act is about to get annihilated.
Mm-hmm.
And the For the People Act takes on a lot of the issues surrounding money in politics. It takes on gerrymandering and reapportionment. It's meant to try and address some of the most significant and damaging flaws in our electoral system today.
Right.
The problem is, and for those who don't know, is that those are not going to pass as long as the filibuster is in place.
Right.
Republicans have looked at these bills to prevent them from achieving their authoritarian goals and called it, basically straight from Satan. They recognize, the smart ones recognize just how dangerous this is. And that's McConnell. In particular, Republican leadership that isn't drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak, is very Gingrichian in its approach to politics, which is this is a war for power.
Right.
And anything besides power and retaining power is essentially irrelevant. Truth, right, wrong, power, and retaining it. And people like Mitch McConnell and Ted Cruz and others, and even Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley, who are all highly educated, recognize these bills to restore voting as the most dangerous thing to them.
Right.
Unfortunately, Sinema and Manchin.
Yes, exactly. And that's just it, is even if you get rid of the and Manchin doesn't want to get rid of the filibuster, and Biden's not pushing it. And that's one of those things where it's like, you got to get rid of the filibuster. It's like the Senate is already, even if you just look at the red states and blue states and purple states and whatnot, it's like they're already ridiculously, there was a guy a while back did analysis. I think you can achieve a majority of the Senate with something like 30% of the US population.
Yeah. It's that low, and that's as little as 19% of the Senate or something can sustain a filibuster, right? Or population.
Yeah.
And what we've got right now is we've got a one-way ratchet. The political system is so far tilted to the right that Republicans can be losing elections, the popular vote in elections by 2, 3, 4%.
Yeah.
And still control the House and the Senate.
Yep.
And the presidency, and that there is no mechanism to make the country go back towards democracy, but there is lots and lots pushing it towards competitive authoritarianism.
Right.
And this is why, without things to restore voting rights and level the playing field, the data says we're probably not gonna make it.
Yeah.
As a country. Because the what if scenario is Republicans have decided that they're going to try and steal the next election. And the question is, it's like the fish at the end of Finding Nemo in the little plastic baggies.
Right.
Well, now what?
Yeah.
And I don't think Republicans have asked the well, now what question, because if you look at some place that's deep blue like California that just had its election overturned, and it becomes absolutely clear that the United States has slid into competitive authoritarianism and that elections have been stolen in broad daylight,
right,
via technical means and by rigging of the court.
Yeah.
Do states that recognize that we are no longer in a democracy and that their votes no longer matter and that they cannot change things, do they choose to remain in the union as the government becomes more and more oppressive towards people who don't believe the way they do? And the answer is that there is a massive cultural gap between the American South and the West and the Northeast. And the data that I have on hand says that California really isn't interested in being part of the Confederate States of America. And the South is adamantly opposed to ever living in a country where, gays can get married and people can get abortions.
Right. Yeah. You bring up gay marriage and abortion. You bring up the filibuster. Here's another popular issue du jour at the moment. And where are you on this? And that's expanding the court to 13 justices, essentially handing Biden 4 appointments, which, as far as I'm concerned, he's owed one, because I won't recognize the legitimacy of Gorsuch after what McConnell did to Merrick Garland's nomination. But basically, where does this rank in terms of getting rid of the filibuster? Any legislative actions? Would it matter? What do you think about expanding the court? And this is not something you touched in the book, by the way. I think this is outside of that.
So I didn't touch on it because it would be helpful, but not necessary. It's one of these things that, yes, you can squeak by restoring voting rights and delivering a message to the Supreme Court that they're not going to gut the new laws protecting voting without risking a packing. And that the Supreme Court, from what I'm told by my insiders, was a little bit stunned by January 6th. Some of it happened right across the street from the Supreme Court, and that they did, in fact, move the justices to a more secure facility, or at least some of them.
Yeah.
So packing the court would be helpful, but in and of itself, it wouldn't solve the problem. It would be
a means to solve the problem moving forward, though. It gives you a tool, which we don't have. It would give you a tool,
but we're not going to get this past Manchin and Sinema. But you do touch on something that genuinely is a problem, right? We have only had one Republican win the popular vote since 1988.
Yeah.
But 15 of the 19 last justices have been nominated by Republicans, right? So we've ended up with a Supreme Court that is far, far, far to the right of the American public in terms of giving corporations broad latitude to abuse employees, in terms of expanding religious freedom to levels that are absolutely insane.
We have not had a Coney Barrett or a Kavanaugh on the court in the past. You have to go back, centuries, not in modern times. Have there been people with the religious? Sorry,
Taney. The justice who issued the Dred Scott decision.
Okay, yeah, right. Okay, exactly. You're going back to find that kind of, and again, that's different. So not just the corporations, but empowering religion in a way that should baffle any legitimate constitutional scholar. And especially, Kavanaugh was bad enough, but Coney Barrett is bound to be the last straw for a lot of people, but also the last straw for abortion access, gay rights, etc. It's scary.
The example I use is the Sixth Circuit decision that says that teachers can verbally abuse transgender students if that verbal abuse conforms with their religious beliefs. And there's a power disparity there between a student and a professor. But it also says that businesses
is
can't regulate employees who want to bring discrimination and harassment into the workplace if that discrimination and harassment has a religious basis, which corporations in America, when I talked to the HR head of my company and told them, look, this is the direction that we're going politically, she looked at me with shock and said, oh my God, if I couldn't do anything about harassment and discrimination, if it was based in religion and there's anti-LGBT stuff and racial stuff happening, I'd quit.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. And corporations eventually could get bit by this in a weird way.
Let's talk about that, because there's two things about the money. There's two things about following the money, because your book describes very well and actually has a really terrifying flow chart of how the money flows to the media, which supports the politicians, which pass laws that get more money and it goes around and around. But there's an interesting point there, and it's sort of a starving the beast from the other end. And there's two things. One, I don't think corporations want their workforce full of bigots yelling at each other and disenfranchising them. Most businesses just want everybody do their damn jobs. Even if they're exploiting, in fact, especially if they're exploiting them, they just want them to do their damn jobs. So it hurts the bottom line to have that kind of workplace. But there's also the aspect of cancel culture, the aspect that we can vote with our pocketbooks, because I don't care what law they pass, it would be pretty hard to pass a law that forces me to buy a product or fly on airlines or watch a TV show. It would be, we can send a message to the corporations. And 5 years ago, I would have laughed at that proposal. But in the last year or two, we've seen corporations step up. And yes, not on economic issues, not on regulation or taxation, but on the social issues that we've touched on. LGBT rights, for example, race issues, stuff like that. You look at how Georgia's being treated right now. You look at what happened in Indiana when Pence was governor, even 4 years ago. Is there a role for good that not capitalism per se, but that corporations recognizing that the right has lost the culture war, that their market is with us? And I'm hearing that more and more from corporations. Is there any reason to believe that can be useful?
I think that corporations could pay a price for doing things that are egregiously bad. But that said, corporations that stay silent only take a little bit of punishment. Corporations that speak up, and I'll use examples like Coca-Cola and I think some of the other companies in Georgia that are speaking up against these voter suppression laws. Yeah, that helps their corporate image overall, because let's face it, most people are against voter suppression. It's only about 30 to 35% of the public that looks at it and says, yeah, let's do that.
Right.
But the problem is that a lot of this is performative.
Sure.
That they are still dropping money into the campaigns of the politicians doing these things.
But if they're constantly facing a boycott, and Coke didn't have an option to stay silent here. A lot of people were saying boycott Coke, boycott Delta. Like they were going to force them to take a position on this. And Coke read what their base wanted. And I mean, it's again, I don't expect them to suddenly start saying tax the rich, or yes, we should totally regulate how we dispose of our waste. Like, no, I'm not that naive, but I think that Coke can look at some of the people that they support and say, all right, look here, we got a good thing going. You got to stop with the racist stuff. You got to stop with the voter suppression stuff. You got to stop putting us in a position where we have to be against what you're doing. Like, that's not a recipe for a long term. And Mitch McConnell's already threatening them, which I think Mitch McConnell, I don't know. He's not a man that has historically overplayed his hand, but I think if he's going to go to these CEOs and say, just shut up and give us your money, I think he might find that he is overplaying his hand. I don't know. Maybe I'm being naive.
I still think it's a bit of a performative dance.
It is.
They still want their tax loopholes and low corporate tax rates.
Right.
Just as McConnell thrashes industry verbally, industry will verbally thrash him, and they'll still send him the campaign check at the end of the day. They will try and hang on to as many customers as possible. Right. Historically, I'm not going to say you're wrong, but I would say that for it to work the way you describe, it would have to run counter to both the characteristics of fascism we've seen in the past and how things have generally worked in terms of competitive authoritarianism in other countries where right-wing populists create an alliance between business and the religious right. To elect the right-wing populists. I would struggle to name a situation where corporations have brought down the right-wing populist government.
Fair enough. Brynn, it is a very thoroughly, well thought out, extremely detailed, probably the most well-sourced and cited book I have ever read. And it is utterly terrifying. I curse you for making me read it, but I truly implore everybody, check this out. American Fascism, How the GOP is Subverting Democracy. Transgresspress.com is carrying it now. Amazon is not at the time of this interview, but I believe they will be by the time this airs. Check it out, guys. You really got to get up to speed on this because we're running out of time. And Brynn, I believe we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming on and telling us about this.
Thanks, Eddie. I really appreciate it.
I want to thank Brynn for coming on the program and for writing this book. I want to give it the highest recommendation I can. Folks, you really need to check this out. This is a summary of everything you're seeing going on, everything I've been talking about, everything your favorite pundit and activists have been talking about. This really boils down to just how far gone we are, and it's a wake-up call to those who maybe don't want to go to, as she said earlier in the interview, the bad place. American Fascism, How the GOP is Subverting Democracy. At the time of this broadcast, it is now available on Amazon. I highly recommend everybody go and check it out. It really, we hit upon all of the key points here, but to really lay it out and to understand, God, part of me just needs hope. Part of me does not want to say, just so you understand how fucked we are. Because to say that really dismisses the situation. But that is the situation that we're in. And back in 2016, when I am ringing the pragmatist's bell of why Hillary Clinton was so important, and we did touch upon in the show here, and she does talk about it in the book. I mean, that does not solve everything. Granted, there's still a lot wrong in a lot of the underlying causes, and Trump was not the cause of all of this bad stuff. As President Obama said, as Brynn mentions, he was a symptom. He was the result of so many years and so many decades of really bad stuff happening and of toxic sludge poisoning and corrupting our political system, mostly coming from corporations and the elite and the oligarchs and whatnot, and using, of course, religion and racism to drive the polls. And we all know it's happening. We've all seen it. We've all talked about it. But this book really lays out just how long it's been going on. And as I read it, I struggled to find a starting point. I struggled to find that point in history where we went wrong, because you can go back further, back further, back further. And again, getting back to that pragmatist bell that I was ringing in 2016, I know a lot of people, I lost a lot of friends on Facebook about that. I probably lost some listeners and followers about that. I was not happy, of course, with the result. But this book really lays out the case for everything that I was talking about then. And it is as critical moving forward, because again, though, I'm probably too obsessed about the Supreme Court. And Brynn, even after the show and during this interview, we did try to emphasize the Supreme Court is not the end all and be all of everything. It is kind of a pet thing for me. It's kind of my obsession, for right or wrong. But she literally lays it out, and there are so many forces at play, and this is what frustrates me about the left, about the side, the liberals, the Democrats, and those to the left of the Democrats, the side that I find myself on, because again, we can all argue with conservatives. That's the easy part. They're just either evil or stupid. One's lying, one's buying, one's getting played, and one's getting paid. We all can recognize those people, and we fight with them all the time, call them morons, whatever. Move on with your life. What frustrates me, though, is whenever I find myself arguing with a leftist or a socialist or a Democrat or a liberal or even a centrist. I'm not saying to the left of me or to the right of me, is better or worse. And the reason I say it is because I don't believe any of y'all are wrong. I don't believe the socialists are wrong. I don't believe the leftists are wrong. I don't believe the Democrats or the pragmatists are wrong. Centrists, I'm getting a little bit tired of Joe Manchin and the cinema there, but I don't believe y'all are wrong. The problem is that I also look at the world and look at where we're going and look at what happens when the left does not have anything resembling the political unity of the right. One of the reasons that they are able to do all of the things that we see and all of the things that Brynn talks about in her book is that they, and I would say this probably started around the Ronald Reagan years, they managed to take libertarians and religious extremists, two people with mutually exclusive agendas, and got them to join together. They took deficit hawks and defense hawks. Once again, people with completely mutually exclusive agendas. They got them to join together, and they joined them together with the libertarians and the religious folks and the oligarchs. And it's not a big tent, but it's a big tent on their side. And they have gotten all of these people that don't really have an inherent reason to all agree on an agenda to do exactly that, to agree on an agenda. What drives them? Well, money, of course. That's what everybody has a price, and Republicans tend to sell out pretty cheap. So, that's what's happening. Meanwhile, on the left, we're trying to get together feminists and civil rights activists, racial activists. We're trying to get together LGBT activists. We're trying to get together socialists and people that want economic reforms. We're trying to get people who want police reforms. We're trying to get unions and labor and people who want better labor protections, minimum wage. Again, all of these disparate agendas that are not even really as much in conflict as some of the agendas on the right. And yet, why do we lose? Because we don't have unity. It goes back to, and when we touched upon it, the Democrats being held to a different standard, not just by the media, which is controlled by the right, and not just by the right, but even by the people within the party. And again, I'm not saying anybody is wrong here. I wouldn't trade any of you folks for the world. I truly love you all, and but it is frustrating to see that we all want the same thing, and none of us are going to get it because we can't seem to have anything resembling the cohesiveness that the right has. And when I bring this up, I'm told I'm vote shaming. I told that I'm doing the politics of fear, the politics of compromise, whatever. But I got to tell you, it is the politics of fear. I am afraid for where we're going. I was afraid in 2016. And I got to tell you, the last 4 years did not make me go, whew, wow, thank God we got past that one. No, the last 4 years, God, if I drew any satisfaction out of saying I told you so, I would be the happiest man alive. But I'm not, because my friends are being hurt, and they will continue to be. And it's hard to call for that unity and bring that unity when I don't think people are necessarily wrong in what they want or even in how they want to go about it. It's just very frustrating. And it's very frustrating to continue to see the Republicans keep moving forward, just doing the most horrible things. And then, you'll get a Democrat that compromises on something or doesn't do one thing that you want them to do, and suddenly we're going to give up on the entire side. And as Brynn describes, it's a ratchet. It only turns one way right now, folks. And until this whole system is broken, and believe me, I'd love to see it broken, burned to the ground. But until it is, the ratchet only turns one way. We can keep it where it is, or it can go to the right. And that is the unfortunate situation that we are up against. And no amount of idealism, liberalism, anything, no amount of anything short of small d democracy is going to change that. And we need systematic change. I don't disagree with hardly any of you on that front. We really do. But I fear that we're not going to get it. And I fear that by the time people are awake to that or are beginning to be turned on to this idea, it's going to be too late. And I, for one, don't want that. Anyway. Thank you for humoring me, and thank you for joining us. Definitely check out Brynn's book, American Fascism, How the GOP is Subverting Democracy. It's available on Transgress Press and Amazon. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments about anything you've heard here tonight or suggestions for future shows, guests, or topics, you can email me at niceguy9418@usa.com. You can find Eddie Cabot on Facebook. You can also find me on YouTube under In My Humble Opinion. It's my YouTube channel. You can also find me at Nice Guy Eddie Cab on Twitter. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and keep it tuned to Rainbow Radio.